You won't be able to even touch another human being on this planet without putting your life in danger. Jerking off is the wave of the future.
Yeah, buddy.
People out there love Jesus, want to go to heaven, and have some concerns about explicit sex, but I think that they're just overselling this.
It starts in the home with the parent. I mean, if the parent is unable to, tell a kid about what...
What is this hole for?
Yeah, I mean, hey.
All right, sir, if you're just about ready for you.
Yeah, yeah.
Ready to go?
You'll get it. You're going to give me a yeah, buddy, on this one, I know.
A big 10-4.
Okay, the club is rolling.
Zappa and the Mothers of Invention took 60s rock and roll through a whole lot of mutations. You were responsible for what then was called the underground in the 1960s. You were part of that formation of that whole thing that was happening then. Now in the 1980s in music, it's very much above ground. It's changed a whole lot, hasn't it?
Well, it's changed, but I don't know what you mean by underground and above ground. What commodity are we talking about that is above the ground and under the ground? You're talking about explicit sexual lyrics in rock records in
we'll
particular?
Talk about that. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Actually, that's part of it. No, part of what you offered and the Mothers of Invention offered was an alternative to the Monkees and the Turtles.
Well, surprising to find out that there is actually an alternative to the Monkees and the Turtles. And of course, once the Turtles joined the Mothers of Invention, it became obvious that they could do both. But there's not too much alternative to the stuff that is being broadcast today.
This is what I was going to ask you, is that now you see that radio has changed dramatically even in the last 10 years. There's not as much outlet for creativity on the radio.
Here's what happened. Here's radio history, okay? Rock and roll is what, 35 years old, something like that. 40 years old maybe. A few guys played shows that were 1 or 2 hours long on certain days of the week, playing certain types of records. It started off like that, and then grew and grew and grew until entire station formats were dedicated to rock, but it was AM. And it became incredibly corrupt, and people were being handed cash to play certain records, and certain people became stars and other people became busboys, irrelevant of what the musical merits were. If you paid off, you got to be a star. And so then they had payola scandals. Somewhere in the 60s, somebody says, well, let's put some of this on FM, which was generally reserved for that mysterious signal that enters the dentist office when you're not looking. And on FM, you could do it in stereo. So since there weren't that many people listening, and there wasn't that much pressure, the FM stations were very creative. You were involved in some of that, and you could play what you wanted, and you could make an art form out of your own broadcast. Every day you had the challenge of putting together something different and unusual, and the audience would like it. Okay, this turned into big business. As more people bought FM receivers, then people said, hey, this could be another AM only in stereo. So they bought FM stations, and FM then became AM in stereo, same freeze-dried formula. Somewhere along the line, the $100 bill stuffed into the sleeve of the 45 RPM record was replaced with the syndrome of the bag of cocaine or a big bag of marijuana, and somebody got the job done. That doesn't happen so much anymore. They're back to cash money. Payola's right there again. And that's the history of rock and roll.
When I knew that we were going to be talking, I sat back and I listened to Freak Out. I listened to a lot of the early Zappa and the Mother stuff. Surprisingly, it wears very well. You'd think it would be dated 19 years later, and it's not. Trouble Coming Every Day, Who Are the Brain Police? These tunes wear very well. They're very topical today in what's going on out there.
Well, yesterday, or was it the day before, was the 20th anniversary of the Watts riots in Los Angeles. And there are people in Watts making speeches on some of the very spots where some of the events in the song I described, like the woman getting machine gunned from her seat and all the rest of that stuff. They're on the spot in Watts trying to make people remember what that big race riot was all about. And at the time that album was recorded, it sold about 40,000 copies, tops, and nobody paid any attention to it. But over the years, it has managed to sell volumes and volumes. Unfortunately, the MGM record company lost track of all of their records. They had a fire, then they had a flood, and they couldn't really tell how many of those things they actually sold. We had to take them to court to find out some of these things, and that's the way it goes with record companies.
You've had a bad time with record companies, between MGM and Warner Bros.
And CBS, who I'm suing now.
That first album that you had, Freak Out, it cost $21,000 to produce, which was an enormous amount of money in those days.
That's right.
What about the cost of producing record albums? That $21,000 wouldn't buy you a week
single.
at a recording. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, well, In those days, the average rock album cost about $6,000 to $8,000 because the average rock album consisted of your hit single plus 9 or 10 other filler tunes that you recorded as quickly as possible, stuck a glossy photo on the cover with some paisley crap around it and stamped it out, and there it was. That was a rock album. But Freak Out was done in a different way. It was a concept album and things had to fit together and so on and so forth. Even at $21,000, which was a startling budget for that time, the record company resisted spending it because, you know, nobody ever spent that and they didn't want to set a precedent. So when we did our second album, they forced us to a budget which was $10,000 or $11,000 and literally threw us out of the studio at a certain point. You know, your vocals aren't done? Okay, too bad. Out. Zip, like that. And that's one of the reasons why I have my own record company now.
Barking Pumpkin Records is your record company. You've got a plethora of new releases that have come out in the last couple of years on that label. Can we clarify? I stopped counting at about 42 record albums that you have. Am I close?
Yeah, it's around 45 now.
Around 45.
Yeah. That's legitimate. And bootlegs are maybe close to 100.
Lots of Zappa bootlegs.
Yeah.
Lots of Zappa bootlegs. A lot of people who have listened to your music over the years, even those of us who have grown up, perhaps think that you know, there's a generation gap, which I can see doesn't exist. I saw you on TV one time on I believe it was a Tom Snyder show. You did with Arthur Fiedler. And here is Zappa and Arthur Fiedler, and I'm seeing a lot of common ground between you guys.
Yeah, well, there's something else happened on that show that I'd like to make a comment about. As I walk out there, you know, there's always the warm-up before they actually turn the camera on. You sit down, you meet the host, you sit there, shake hands. Okay, hi. I never met Tom Snyder in life. I sit in the chair, they strap on the microphone, the guy starts saying this. Here's a quote. You know, last year, I made $2 million here in New York. And then he starts scratching his neck and scratching around like he had the red spiders on him. Okay, that's what he wants to tell me. That's the first words out of his mouth. Okay, I'll accept that. So we do the interview, and he goes, well, Frank, what about these groupies? And, you know, that kind of crap. So a few weeks later, I did an interview with a newspaper in Chicago, and I told the same story. And then a little while after that, when the newspaper article came out, he opened his show by taking this newspaper and twisting it and throwing it away. I can't help it if he's got red spiders and wants to tell me how much money he makes.
Well, Frank, what about these groupies? When you did Freak Out, the first album that the Mothers of Invention did, it was an interesting album because it was the first concept album. It was the first, if you will, rock opera album. There was a lot of entwining themes going on.
I mean, it was the first double album.
It was the first double album, especially for a band, for their first album. It was a double album. I mean, there was a lot of history going on with that.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why that history was possible to be made was the producer that we had for that album was a man named Tom Wilson, who is unfortunately deceased now. But he was the guy who made that possible. He took the heat from the record company and was the one who actually spent the $21,000 and let us finish it.
With your film 200 Motels, you did some things in that movie that almost we would expect from the Beatles to see. There was a lot of surrealism. You shot the movie on video, you transferred it to film footage. You did things that were almost Beatlesque in 1971. At this point in time, the Beatles were defunct. They weren't even together anymore. Ringo had a cameo performance in the movie.
Well, he had a more than cameo performance in the movie. Ringo played me. And as far as some of the things that were done, it was the first time they were done. That was the first feature-length motion picture shot on videotape and then transferred to film. The technical effects that were in there are the precursor of maybe 70% of the technical effects that you'll see on MTV or any kind of video channel now. And they were done with experimental hooking up of mundane equipment that was available at that time. At that time, the video editing itself had to be done manually. They didn't even have computers like a CMX to edit the video together. I had to edit that film in video form, standing up in an area that was about as wide from here to there. It was like a trailer, ice cold room. A mark with a magic marker on the edge of the tape, and then back up 10 seconds from that, and then push the button on 2 machines, and then it would roll in and hope that it locked. Okay? And every edit in that film was done that way. And then it was transferred to 35 millimeter, and the soundtrack was synchronized, the sweeteners were added, sound effects and so forth, and it was done. And when it first played in Los Angeles, there were technical people from the motion picture industry there at the screening, certainly not because they wanted to see a rock movie, but they were walking up to the screen to see whether they could see any video lines in it. Because the company that transferred the film had a device they called a wobulator, which took the scan lines and looped them like this, and then sandwiched them on top of each other, which helped to wash out the scan. That's why 200 Motels has that appearance. But the saddest thing about 200 Motels is the producer of the film, in order to be a really fiscally prudent individual, all of the film was originally shot on 2-inch PAL, good quality, you know, better quality than US video, 2-inch reels, and there was maybe 25 or 30 of them. He had them bulk erased and resold for scrap, thereby putting $3,000 or $4,000 back into the film budget in order for him to go to the United artists who had put up the money for the film and say, see, we're really tight with the budget, you know, like maybe next time we'll get to do it again. It was so stupid. Do you know what those videotapes would be worth today, the original material?
Uncountable fortunes.
Yeah,
I mean, seriously, that's art.
Yeah. And so, you know, somebody saved $3,000 or $4,000 in order to do that.
Everything that that you've been involved with has been labeled, and I know how much you like labels, but art rock and avant-garde and things like that. Your training, what kind of training, and in technical training, even with video and stuff like that, as a kid, how did you start out with music?
Well, first of all, I'm a middle-aged Italian, father of 4 with a high school education. Everything else that I learned by doing it. You go out and you do it. I learned how to do video editing in 1 week, the hard way. Freezing cold in that room with a magic marker in my hand, you know, with 2 English editors whose main goal in life was to go across the street to the pub and return to the editing room with tumblers like this full of Guinness, you know, that brown, dangerous liquid, and they were just, you know, okay, that was fun. But, you know, if you have a technically oriented mind and you want to learn the discipline of doing that stuff, unless you're the one who has to tweak the machine or replace the resistors in it, you can learn the concept of doing these kind of things fairly easily.
You know, really, Frank Zappa, it's kind of the story of the all-American self-made man. You're a fundamentalist when it comes to the Constitution. I know you don't like anybody to mess with that. You believe in the First Amendment. We were talking earlier.
I want to see somebody who doesn't believe in the First Amendment. I mean, where are these people that don't believe? Everybody says they believe in it, but what are you willing to do about it? You know,
well, people want to change it. They want to.
They want to rewrite it so it sounds like the 1.2 amendment.
As a writer, you've done a lot of writing, and of course with your music. As a producer, you've produced a lot of people coming out of the Los Angeles underground scene that we're talking about. You produced the GTOs, you produced Wildman Fisher, you produced Captain Beefheart.
I produced the first Lowell George single, which never got released.
Lowell George was in your band, as a matter of fact, the Mothers of Invention at one point. And
Yep.
Lowell had a very large following here in Washington with Little Feat.
Yeah, there's still a tape someplace in my vault of a song called Lightning Rod Man, and the other side was called Black Protruding Tongue, when Lowell had a group called The Factory.
As a musician, it's not just rock for you. It's like operas like Billy the Mountain and projects like that. Did you ever find it difficult, I mean, to go from an instrument like guitar into scoring things that have been played by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra chorus, people like that?
Well, here's how I got into business. When I first started off, I was a consumer of rhythm and blues. I never thought I could play it. I liked to listen to it. I used to collect rhythm and blues records. But while I was doing that, I was writing chamber music and writing orchestral music. I started writing that when I was 14. I didn't write a rock and roll song until I was in my 20s. And I wrote all this music and sent it to orchestras. Nobody would play it. So I figured if I'm writing music, I better write in a medium where I can get a musician to play it. I remember taking one of my compositions to the guy who was then the conductor of the Baltimore Symphony. His name was Massimo Freccia. And I was so young, you know, he looked at me like, you know, how can you possibly be a composer? And was giving me this quiz as we're walking down the street. What's the lowest note on a bassoon? Well, B flat. You know, I mean, it's hard to convince somebody if you don't look like you're from a university or something that you can write music. So I just said, and went out and did something else. How many fingers am I holding up?
When you left Warner Brothers Records, it seems that you got more creative. When Shake Your Booty came out, it seems that your return to your satire and your scope seemed to be, you get back to some of that that you had started out with again. It seemed to inspire you when you left Warner Brothers Records, and you...
It would inspire you too if you had been with that company for 8 years, I'll tell you. But the real thing that determines the character of each album is who's on it. because certain bands have certain types of things that they do well and certain types of things that they do badly, and you can't take a band that is specializing in one sort of thing and make them do something else. For example, you couldn't get the band that had Mark and Howard from the Turtles to look or sound like the band that had Ruth Underwood and George Duke. It's two different worlds. Well, it's the same idea of the music. You want to have a different medium of expression. So some people like one era of the albums over the others, and some people hate them all, and that's fine. They should be free to do that.
With 45 albums, I think there's something for everybody with Frank Zappa's music.
Well, I think so, but the problem is getting it out to the public, because since today, in order to really have exposure on the radio, you do have to pay off, and I refuse to do it. And the other thing that you have to do is play the MTV ball game, and you know, up to a certain point, I'll cooperate with MTV. I'll do interviews for them, and you know, I've been on there before. But it's the whole ethic of selling music via picture, where ultimately the picture is the most important thing you're selling. You don't listen to the song anymore. You're looking at the girl's legs getting out of the car, her butt going up and down like that, and, you know, can you really see her tits through the thing? You know, that's what that has turned into, and it's got nothing to do with the song. And after you've watched some of those promos, the saturation point comes after maybe 6 or 7 viewings, and if you're just listening to a record, you can listen to a record hundreds of times because the appreciation is on a different level. And my field is music. I like to write music, and that's what I'm interested in. So the audience for what I do is probably shriveling up like a prune, but you know, that's tough tuckus. I'm not going to change my tactics in order to do something else. If you like it, it's there, and if you don't like it, go do something else.
Again, the technology that you're using with your music, you're recording digitally. You're doing the state-of-the-art recording with Barking Pumpkin Records right now.
Yeah, well, if you're going to make a record, why not do it the best way that it's possible to do it? I think that a person who spends the money on the record has worked hard enough for the $8 or whatever it is that he's spending on the album, so show him a good time.
I've been listening to your music for 20 years and watched it pretty carefully. You are a purveyor of the music business. I mean, you know what's going on, what's happening. What do you see happening in the future? What do you see 10 years down the line?
Well, it depends on who wins the censorship business that's going on. You know, one way, here I'll give you the bleakest outlook, okay? Let's say that these deranged housewives of Washington, D.C. succeed in prodding the Congress or whatever into enacting legislation that opens the door for the type of censorship that you would have in the Soviet Union. You know, Pravda Rock. It has to be state approved, and it has to have that kind of aroma that makes it look and smell like something really Christian. And they would do things like this. They would get the foot in the door, and then they would say, this is not enough, we must go directly to the root of the problem. And do you know what the root of the problem is? The root of the problem is the alphabet itself. Certain letters, then certain words could not then be formed. And we would have this new approved Christian alphabet with about 6 or 7 consonants in it. You wouldn't even be able to spell Jesus Christ with this new alphabet. Then they would go directly to the numbers that we all use when we're adjusting our little bank books and so forth. And they would say, there are 4 numbers here that are suggested. There's one that looks like a hole, and there's another one that's sticking straight up. They've got to go. And those 2 that fit together, one that looks like it's upside down against the other one, which we can't say, they've got to go. So now you fix the alphabet and you fix the number system. Now we're going to work on the national bird. Now the eagle is okay, but he's an endangered species. We're going to go for the ostrich. The ostrich represents the way things really are. When the ostrich gets scared, it sticks its head in the ground, it sticks its ass up in the air, and it quakes a little bit. Okay? That'll be the new American national bird. Now the flag. The red is too racy, the blue is too deep, and the white is too hard to keep clean. We're going to do away with that. It's going to be beige. It doesn't offend anybody, and it looks great as wallpaper on a Marriott.
This is the bleakest outlook.
Yeah, and the best is, we'll say, look, let's be reasonable about this. Sex is good for you. It's a natural function. There is no reason to think that a person shouldn't know about how his own body works at the earliest possible age. Just because you know about intercourse, masturbation, or any of that doesn't mean you have to go out and do it when you're 5 years old, okay? It doesn't hurt to know. Why keep people ignorant? The more you know, the happier you're going to be, all right? So don't be afraid of words that make you think about sex. You're not going to die from it. You're not going to go to hell from it. You could die from it if you get AIDS, of course. Government's got something to do with that. They got to spend a little bit more money on it, but you know, the good outlook would be people will say this is unrealistic, it's overblown, it is cotton candy news, and they would just forget it. But that's not going to happen because America has gone too far to the right to just say, okay, I think this is a mistake.
While we're on the subject of America, when I was growing up in the 1950s, I grew up in suburban Massachusetts outside of Boston. You could drive a couple of hours one way up into New Hampshire, or you could drive down to New York, and the countryside looked remarkably different when you were in different areas. Things looked different. And now, here we are in the 1980s, with the burger franchises and things like that. Everything looks remarkably the same.
Well, you know,
is this related to the check-writing nincompoops that you refer to?
I think that it's a reflection of the attitude of the times. People today are, in a way, mentally more like the people of the 50s because they're so very conformist. They're so afraid of what's going on that they don't want to take the risk of being an individual. Everybody, when they go home, they go, oh, no, am I tired of acting like that? You know, I had to do that to keep my job. Oh, I hate that. Now I'm going to take a bunch of drugs and forget about it, you know. There's a lot of pressure on people because they want to be themselves. You were not born as a clone of somebody else. You're an individual, I'm one, you know, you're one. All of you out there, you're one too. So you got a right to be yourself. But there's all this pressure to act like a certain kind of a person so that you can have certain kinds of friends and fit in somewhere so that you can be certified as a label. You say, oh, I've got it. I like the idea of being a yuppie. So even if you're not one, you know, you'll make yourself one so that you can go to a yuppie bar. And then when yuppies don't want to be called yuppies anymore, you'll turn into whatever they turn into. You got to have that stuff going for you. I mean, it's a waste of time. Who wants friends like to borrow money from you?
Hey, sir.
Okay.
Final two-shot it is.
What is
Yeah.
your plans? what? Take it again. Your plans for the future. Can we expect a tour? Products coming out?
You won't see a tour, but I'm coming back to Washington, D.C. when Goldwater has these hearings on the porno rock. And I'm going to come back and make my testimony about it because I don't represent the record business. I'm a middle-aged Italian guy with 4 kids. I write music, and I don't like the idea of having somebody who was never elected. I didn't vote for him. You know, these housewives, I didn't vote for them now. I don't want them messing with my rights and with First Amendment rights, you know, and I will fight it. I'll do that rather than doing a tour.
Is this the chrome-plated megaphone of destiny that you wrote about all those years ago?
You know what that is? It's part of the problem. The chrome-plated megaphone of destiny is that little chrome pee hole on the bottom of those dolls they give to girls, okay? And sometimes they're boy dolls. Now, what do you think that does to the imagination of a kid when he finally finds out that on a human being, that little chrome doodad ain't there? You know, it's a big breakthrough. They're putting the little plastic dorks on some of them now. That is the chrome-plated megaphone of destiny. What you don't know can hurt you.
I want to thank you for coming by and talking to us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Frank.
All right.
Thank you.
Why? Oh, God, he said that. Oh, no.
No, I never heard the chrome-plated megaphone.
My dolls never had that, no.
You want Frank to be talking at all, or am I just...
I'll turn my head so it'll look like my jaw is going like that, like they do on 60 Minutes. You know, the last time I did CNN, I was on the Sandy Freeman show, to see the show.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And that's the guy that wanted to take over CBS. Foam-plated megaphone of destiny with this. It's out like this, and poof, and whew, then 2, and how many fingers am I holding up? And then you take this, and it goes around like that, and right in there, and that's the chrome-plated megaphone of destiny. Hole, and then it's like this. Oh, watch this. Is this still on? You're going to hear what I'm saying? You're printing sound? I saw this on television. This is, you ever watch the Crouches on TBN?
Sure.
Okay. Have you ever noticed his hand movements when he's talking to somebody? You know what he does?
Yeah.
When he's making a point. He was interviewing Dr. Schuller with the Crystal Cathedral, and as he builds his idea up, he points at the guy, and as he builds his idea up, he rubs his finger like this, and when he finally is going to say it, he goes like that at him, and he kept doing it. I was going, what is the body language involved here mean? What do these guys do when the camera goes off? If I sat on television and went, whew, like that, you'd think I was weird.
Sure.
Yeah. Also, if I sat on here and said what Candy said, you'd think I was weird. Oops. You know what those two guys were talking about, though, on the show? They were talking about balancing the budget. Two religious guys balancing the budget on every channel. And he was going to go on there and say, we need $1 billion from someone, $1 billion donation to help the national debt. He says, I know there are some out there who could give it. And like that. He was serious. And Crouch was sitting there agreeing with him, and the wife was sitting there with the tears rolling down her face and the mascara making puddles on her pinafore. These people are a joke. But one of the more interesting things that happened